I'm honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Robert Dunn. I had the pleasure of sharing the office next door to Rob when we both worked on our PhDs at University of Connecticut. Since those days in the early 2000s, Rob has gone on to find success in everything he touches. I personally think this is because Rob nurtures creativity in himself and others. While he was working on his PhD in ecology, Rob won the Wallace Stevens Prize in Creative Writing at University of Connecticut 4 years in a row. So this was a PhD student in ecology winning the creative writing awards, which is fantabulous. And that spirit of creativity clearly lives on in Rob's writing, and thus why I'm suggesting you strongly consider purchasing some of his books, of which there are 7 that have been published, at least in 15 languages. Actually, this might be 8. I'm not sure. I'm losing track. He's so prolific. And then there's countless articles in the popular press, from National Geographic to Wired magazine, documentaries, award, scientific publications across a baffling number of domains. His list of funded grants is possibly the most eclectic that I've ever encountered. Some really wild stuff. And Rob's done a lot in a lot of places, but mostly working as a professor, teacher, researcher, and beloved colleague. And now it sounds like he's got a gig, at least temporarily, as a vice provost or assistant provost. Sorry, Rob, I'm screwing that up. At North Carolina State University, where he serves as the William Neil Reynolds Distinguished Professor in the Department of Applied Ecology. I think Rob is this dangerous combination of being smart, creative, and funny. We're fortunate that he uses those talents as a force for good. And we're fortunate to have Rob with us tonight. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Robert Dunn. Thanks, Robert, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Michael. I love giving these Nat Talks. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm especially delighted to notice that in the audience is Dan Taylor. And I worked with Dan Taylor when I was 21 years old or 20 years old. And Dan was working on tropical fruit bats and seed dispersal in Ghana, and allowed me to tag along for a little bit, which was a pretty amazing life experience for me. And it wasn't much longer after that that I met Michael at the University of Connecticut. So this feels very, it's a talk near and dear to the connections in my life. So thank you for gathering and for giving the reason for those connections. I am going to talk about a big thing today, which is the future of life, the natural history of the future. To zoom in just slightly from that really, really big thing, I'm going to focus on the natural history of cities. And I'm going to do so using the city as a microcosm and a metaphor for the broader story of the living future. And so while I'm talking about cities, recognize that I'm also thinking about everything else that's going on. And I think a lot of what we can learn about and think about when we think about cities is relevant to the rest of life. And the big thing I'm going to say today, and I'll make the point now, and you can, go do your own thing if you need to, is that however we think about the future, we need to account for life. We need to account for the biodiversity around us. We need to account for life's rules. And we typically don't. And so what shouldn't be a radical sentiment that we're still connected to the living world and will remain connected has become a radical sentiment in our modern context. And so I'm going to sort of belabor this very succinct point into an hour-long talk, but hopefully in an enjoyable way. And why I'm starting by focusing on cities is because I think they're intrinsically interesting, but also, as I think as we well know, increasingly most of us live in cities today. More than half of humans on Earth live in cities. Many people live in mega cities, and this is only going to become more true in the future. And so if we think about the living world as a function of what we see with our eyes, what we sense with our senses in the average daily human life, the living world is really disproportionately weighted toward city urban life. And so I think it's a pretty interesting context to think about. But before I get to cities, I want to go back to thinking about settlements more generally and make a minor point. And the minor point is that for most of human history, our settlements, our houses were really built with local conditions in mind. They were built out of local materials, and so they depended on which things were available, which plants you could use, which mud you could use. But they also were built in ways that made sense given the climate, given the conditions. And so you see amazing convergence around the world among houses built in similar conditions. And so in flooded conditions, you often see houses on stilts, for example. This doesn't seem like a radical innovation, but it happens again and again. I find it intriguing. But what's even more intriguing is that as we move toward living in cities, initially cities were also locally adapted. And so if you think about the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, this is Ur, not a photo of Ur, a recreation of Ur. Those cities also had connections to the local landscape. They were built in ways that made sense given local conditions, but that would become less and less so. And especially in the Western tradition, people would eventually begin to see cities as a reflection, not of local conditions, but of ideas, ideologies, and forces. And so, for example, this painting of the ideal city celebrates the values in a well-ordered society with architecture standing as a metaphor for good government. And so look here, nature's gone. You don't see any plants, there are no animals. In fact, in this case, there aren't even any humans. And you might know where this is because of the style of the painting, but you have no cues really in terms of the structure of the buildings with regard to whether you're in the tropics or the Mediterranean, or, I mean, probably you're not in a tundra, but the buildings on their own don't tell you that. And this would become ever more true, and it would accelerate the sense in which buildings were abstracted from their environments, and it would accelerate as our engineering prowess accelerated. And so, for example, in the US, we start to see anti-gravity cities, where cities are really defined relative to the force of gravity. No plants here, no birds, no mountains, no rivers. We see gravity and we see buildings, we see human power. And this anti-gravity city celebrates the power of engineering relative to the force of gravity. And it comes in different versions. There's all sorts of art that reflects this movement, but there are also buildings that reflect this movement. If you look in cities, buildings built during this period were really about confronting gravity. That was a dominant theme. And once you confronted gravity, once you went up, you then had new other things to account for, like how do people actually move between the buildings? And so you see all these imaginative ways in which buildings had to then accommodate people, but the people were secondary. Gravity was first. And so in this case, there's some kind of little track line that moves people sitting in what look like, you know, dentist waiting chairs from one building to another. And this is what we imagined would happen. Eventually you get the Moto city. And so now cities become defined not just relative to ideals and gravity, but now also relative to an invention, relative to the force of cars. And the Moto city really celebrates and responds to the power of the car as a nature-like force. And this is envisioned, it's depicted before it's built, and then it comes also to be built. And one could reasonably argue that many of our cities today are really engineered relative to cars, the cars acting like a kind of gravity to which we respond more than we respond to humans, for example. And then if we look at depictions of future cities today, what we often see are smart cities. And so here the city becomes framed relative to the internet and algorithms. And the smart city celebrates and responds to the nature-like power of the internet. And I picked and chose a little bit with regard to the images I'm using here, but these themes come up again and again in histories of architecture, histories of urbanization, that these are things against which to which we respond. And what I want you to notice is that in these themes, the environment has receded. Adaptation no longer occurs in relation to local climate or local biological realities. The idealized city has become abstracted and exists in reference to physical universals, particular innovations, and to a lesser extent, local culture. Culture has also partially disappeared in these images, not in the real cities where it's playing a big role. And then life and climate are excluded through control. And this actually gets more and more extreme as the depictions go on. For example, there's this amazing Buckminster Fuller imagining of a Manhattan that's actually protected by a bubble. And so air from outside the bubble doesn't get in, climate is controlled, animals don't get in, people from the other boroughs don't get in. It's really the conclusion of this trajectory where we bring the city into isolation. And this is also what we see if we look at how people imagine cities and other planets. They're in bubbles. This is an old-timey image, but if you look at new imaginings of settlements in space, they still have the same sort of bubbled feel. And this, of course, is also what we see in the Jetsons. And every time I talk about this, I think I'm going to remember the name of the dog, and I never do. Is it Pluto? Is that the name? Somebody can tell me in the chat. But what you notice here is that they're in a bubble, and not only are they in a bubble, but they've got their domesticated animal in a bubble, and there are no other animals. There are no plants. Everything is bubbled. And in fact, one of the interesting things that happens is that even as cities begin to get gardenified, which is this moment in the history of urbanization, that in many cases, this gardenification has actually started to happen inside the bubble still. And so this is a vision of, I think, New Jersey in this case, of Dixon de Pommier, who imagines these green gardens, the vertical gardens in the city. And so people don't have to go far for their food. And there are lots of advantages to this. But I think from the perspective of my talk, the key thing to notice is that life is now moved indoors. And all that's left outdoors here are those pigeons or seagulls, whatever those happen to be. And so more and more, as we're imagining the city, we seem to have imagined it within our own hands, as being controlled by us, as being separated from everything else by us. And it shouldn't be too hard to recognize that this is also what we're doing with the rest of the earth, that the city here is a microcosm for what we're more generally doing. And I love this painting, but I find this sentiment deeply problematic, because I think implicit in this view of the city, implicit in all these views in which we abstract ourselves, is a set of false assumptions. And I'm going to work through them today. One is knowingness, one is lifelessness, one is control, one is independence, and then another is a living world without agency. And so what I'm now going to do is to work through these one by one, talk about the assumption, and then talk about a kind of rule of life that defies that assumption, and that really is a more sensible way forward than are these assumptions. And the take home of the talk, the take home of the book, is really that life is a force more powerful than gravity, cars, or the internet, and that we're only going to make sensible decisions about the future if we understand our assumptions and life's rules, what I call in the book laws, but you can call them regularities, call them what you want. But we need to make sense of these. We need to take these into account as we imagine our future cities, our future Earth, our future everything. So the first assumption that's baked into every plan we make about the future is knowingness. And this is an assumption that scientists are as guilty of it as anybody. It's hard not to make this assumption. And the assumption is basically that we more or less understand the world. And how could we not? Of course, we can do remarkable things now. We can grow human organs in a pig. You know, how could we not more or less understand things when that's true? And yet, as Michael would be quick to tell you, the truth is when we look out at the living world, most of it is still not known. Most of it is still very poorly understood. And one of my favorite stories in this regard relates to this guy who recently passed away, amazing beetle evolutionary biologist, systematist, Terry Irwin. And Irwin, early in his career, went to Panama and was fogging trees to get beetles to fall out of them. And like many systematists, he was very specialized. And so he wanted a particular kind of beetle, ground beetles, which by a fluke of nomenclature, pretty much only live in trees, especially in the tropics. And so this was the best way to get the beetles out of the tree. He would lift these foggers up and kill them, and the beetles would fall down. And so when he was studying the beetles, he found that many of the species that fell down around him were totally new to science. Even the genera were new to science. These were big, interesting branches in the tree of life. But then as he started sending his samples to other people, they would tell him that, hey, the lace bugs are all new to science too. The moths are all new to science. The leaf-feeding beetles are new to science. And suddenly he started to recognize that everything falling out of this tree seemed to be new to science. And then he fogged the second kind of tree, and everything that was falling out of that second kind of tree was new to science too, but it was different than what was in the first kind of tree. And so he found himself just really dumbfounded. And at that point, Peter Raven, who was at the Missouri Botanical Garden at the time, wrote him and asked him, Terry, how many arthropod species, insects and their relatives, do you think there might be on Earth? And Terry did a kind of ballpark estimate, which resulted in this 2-page paper that maybe there are 30 million species of arthropods on Earth. And this caused a ferocious passive-aggressive fight among entomologists about whether this is the right number, is it lower, is it higher? And the resolution to this, I think, is mostly that we still know too little to know for sure is 30 million wrong. But the number that's comfortable to people, the set of numbers are these that come from a paper by Nigel Stork, who you see here. And what Nigel now estimates is that there are 1.5 million beetle species, 5 million insect species, 7 million arthropod species in total, which means 80% of those are undiscovered. And so here some humility is merited in that of arthropod species, if you walk outside in a tropical habitat, the vast majority have not been named, much less studied in any way. And so we really can't predict them on an individual basis, what will happen to them with climate change, what will happen to them with habitat loss. We need to know general rules about them because we're still so early in this study. And so when I was a graduate student, this blew my mind. But what blew my mind even more is a more recent study, not of arthropods, but of bacteria. This is a beautiful Pseudomonas picture by Scott Chmielewski. And for a long time, people have really not even tried to guess how many bacteria species there are. But a few years ago, Kenneth Losey and Jay Lennon gave it a good effort. And they used some sort of basic rules of biology to predict how many species of bacteria there might be. And I should say that the number of named bacteria species is about 30,000. Well, what Losey and Lennon estimated is that there are 1 trillion species of bacteria. Now, people are skeptical of this estimate, but even if you take 3 zeros off, you still get 1 billion species of bacteria, and just 30,000 are named. And so from the perspective of arthropods, most of life is unknown. From the perspective of bacteria, we've just begun to fumble with things. And then we know that most bacteria species have their own viruses, their own bacteriophages. And so there may be 1 trillion bacteriophage species, and far fewer than 30,000 bacteriophages have been named. And so we're only just beginning. The second assumption that I think is near and dear to our hearts as ecologists is that life is fragile, that we're at the end of nature. And here I don't doubt that the life that we love, the life that we are most likely to notice, the life that is most likely to benefit us is indeed fragile. The diversity of life, of species that we tend to see is fragile. But the existence of life, that life persists, has no such fragility. It is not precarious. Life, in fact, is far more tolerant of extremes than is humanity. And one of the places in my own work that we've seen this very conspicuously is when we started to study places like Manhattan. Here you see Manhattan. The green areas, like Central Park in the middle, that's what biologists typically studied. We decided a number of years ago to focus on the gray areas. And so habitats like this. And when we did, people told us we wouldn't find very much, but we thought, well, we're going to go look anyway. What do we find in the buildings on Broadway? What do we find in houses? And we embarked on this first looking at arthropods. This is Matt Bertone, who really led a lot of this work. Went into 40 houses to see how many arthropods might there be in these habitats where we've intentionally tried to cause the end of nature. We have tried to kill everything in our houses. We've used pesticides, fungicides, antibiotics. If there's an end of nature, it should be around us in our dwellings. What did Matt find? Well, what all the other entomologists said we would find were these friendlies that nobody likes. And we did find some of them, but they actually weren't that common. Instead, we found that every habitat in the house had its own kinds of species. and that they were very diverse. This is an amazing painting by Eleanor Olson, who did this painting in response to our work, which was one of the more thrilling things in my career. Another painting by Eleanor. And so as Eleanor's painting shows, if you went around the house, you would see each of these little habitats had its own species, and they were pretty predictable. And overall, in just the first 40 houses, we found more than 1,000 species of arthropods, many of them actually specialists on the indoors. And so here's a whole lot of life where we imagined the end of nature. But as we zoomed in and looked at smaller things, the picture became even more riddled with living things. And what you see here is somebody swabbing dust on their door sill. And what we figured out we could do like 10 years ago with Noah Fear at the University of Colorado is have people send us that dust. And then we could do sort of a CSI Bed Bath and Beyond and decode which species were living in people's houses based on which DNA was in that dust. And so this made us look like Santa's workshop for a long time. But what did we find? Just really quickly for today, we found thousands of plant species in houses, more than 40,000 fungal species in houses, which is more kinds of fungi than there are named in North America, 2,000 arthropod species just based on their DNA, 80,000 bacteria species. And we never got around to protists, and we probably won't. We're busy. And so it's not even a complete survey yet. But tons of life in a place we expected to have killed everything. And in fact, what we found is the more extreme the habitat in the house, the more likely it was to have life. And so hot water heaters have bacteria species that are only found in hot water heaters and in hot springs. Refrigerators have Arctic species. Fermented foods have all sorts of extremophiles. And there are all these amazing fungi living in the soap dish in your dishwasher, including a fungus species that's known only from dishwashers and the feces of tropical fruit bats. And then we even found life inside salt crystals, in salt shakers, life that's living inside the grains of salt and often shaped, it's in a square, in a cube, so it best fits in the salt crystal. And so there's life all throughout these places. We imagine we've killed everything. In fact, never have we found lifelessness, and despite our actions, there's no sign of the end of living nature in our homes. And if we look globally, what we see is that the worst of our assaults nonetheless favor some species. And so giant plastic piles favor bacterial species that love plastic. Oil spills favor a whole suite of unusual oil-loving bacteria. This isn't what we want, but it's also not the end of nature. It's the end of species that we love, the end of species that allow us to flourish, the end of species with amazing, interesting histories. But we should distinguish that from life itself ending. Assumption 3 is that we're in control. And what we've seen in houses is that our control is modest and that we should once again be humble. And we see that, for example, in this figure, and this is a kind of map that microbiologists like to use. The closer together 2 points are, the more similar those 2 samples are in terms of which bacteria they had. And each dot is one of those swabs I showed you. And so one of the things you can see is these blue dots are samples from outside sort of habitats. And so door sills. And so you're getting a lot of leaf-associated microbes, soil-associated microbes. These green dots are food-associated things. And so you see them mostly in the kitchen. And then this one dot where somebody threw a hot dog at a TV or something, I don't know. And then this is the body-associated microbes. And so we can't really tell pillowcases and toilet seats apart, but they're both dominated by our bodies and the microbes that fall from them. And so this is the single most dominant set of factors that influence what's going on biologically in your house. It's just basically how you move about your house and what you do. This is not extreme control. It's kind of like control as Pigpen would have it. And we see the same thing if we think about who lives in a house. And so we can tell men's houses from women's houses as a function of the relative abundance of armpit bacteria and vaginal bacteria. And so we're affecting what lives in our houses just by being there as a function of who is there. If you have a dog, it has a huge impact on what's in your house. But that's not why you got a dog. It's not really that we're intentionally introducing dogs so as to change our microbiomes. But in houses with dogs, there are a whole suite of bacteria species that are more common, not only on pillowcases, not only on their beds, but also even on TV screens. They're just floating all around. And then we also see that if you eat fermented foods, if you make fermented foods, that those microbes are lifting up and around. And so this is a little bit more like a control, but we don't always know that we're doing it. As an aside, we've also been able to show that people who make sourdough bread a lot, the bakers that we've studied, they have fundamentally different skin microbiomes as a function of working with that bread. And so most people have like 2 to 5% lactobacillus lactic acid bacteria on their hands. Some of the bakers we've studied had 70%. And so their hands are like sort of just starters that they can dip into water and start fermenting. But it's an aside, but relevant to the bit. And then how you heat or cool your house. And again, none of these things do we do in order to control life in our houses. It's just secondary consequence of decisions we're making. And to me, the even more amazing part of our lack of control here is that Megan Temes, who's now at the University of San Diego, has been able to show that when you look at chimp nests, that the microbes that you find in chimp nests tend to be ones we think of as healthy. They're leaf microbes and soil microbes, basically no chimp microbes in their nests. Versus when you look at human houses, we're far more likely to have inadvertently favored microbes that are actually bad for us. The exception here is drinking water. Having clean drinking water saves hundreds of millions of lives. It's one of the best things we ever invented. But with regard to the broader microbiology of the home, we're doing worse than the chimps do. And so we're not quite so clever yet. It's tempting when you look at this to think that we studied mostly dirty people. And I think it's easy to imagine that, well, those dirty people had all those things living in their houses, but I can seal my building, I can filter my air, I can scrub and isolate. In this context, it's useful to think about the International Space Station and the now defunct Mir, the Russian space station, because these should represent the best we're ever going to be able to do in terms of excluding life. These are the best bubbles we've ever made. And so what lives in these bubbles? You know, and these are bubbles where the astronauts get scrubbed, the astronauts get checked, all the stuff that goes up gets bleached, the windows don't let anything in. So if anywhere was going to be lifeless, this should be it. And yet, what we find up there in these space settlements are tons of fungi, dust mites, even tapeworms. And in fact, most of the fungi were plastic eaters or even metal eaters, species super tolerant of extremes. And this included fungi that grew over the windows of the Mir to the point of making it impossible to see outside. And so the grandeur of space was actually obscured by the power of life. And the bacteria looked mostly like toilet seat bacteria. And so when we try to clean everything away, what we end up with is a dwelling that's mostly filled with our own microbial falling apart. Humble control. The one place we do have control in our daily lives is through the use of all of these biocides. And when used carefully, these biocides help to save lives. Some of you here today had your lives saved by antibiotics. You're here today because of antibiotics. We have more food because of herbicides and insecticides and BT crops. But it's also true that we overuse all of these things. And for antibiotics, we use them. Most uses of antibiotics are actually for things that are not treated with antibiotics. And what that does is to offer a very strong kind of control on our dwellings. And what that control does is to favor things that are resistant to those biocides. And so this we find in houses around the world, that our use of biocides is very consistently favoring all of these resistant things that we don't know how to kill when we need to. Assumption 4 is sort of Elon Musk assumption. It's the assumption that we're independent. It's the assumption that if you look at this Calder mobile, that we're sort of at the top of it and there are other species that depend on us. And if we just make good decisions, we don't need to worry about those other species. And this is the assumption that's implicit in all of the planning for imagining new kinds of space settlements. We just need to bring the right plants with us. We'll bring some soil. We're going to eat those plants. Maybe we'll bring a couple of pigs and we'll figure it out. And this is a very popular model of the future. The trouble with this model is that our actual relationship to the rest of life is far more like this piece at the bottom of the mobile. And to me, the emblem of our relationship with the rest of life is really the termite or the termites. And this is a beautiful picture of a termite queen. She's physogastric, so her belly is swollen with eggs. And one of the defining features of termites is that most termites rely on very specific gut microbiomes, not just for digestion, but in order to exist at all. And in many cases, those microbes and the termites are mutually unculturable. We don't know how to grow the termites without their microbes. We don't know how to grow the microbes without their termites. And we have known this for going on 100 years. It's not news, but it's news for us. It's only recently that we're realizing that we're like these termites and that our lives are not fully culturable unless we account for those other species that we need. And we're seeing all sorts of medical problems associated with not passing the right microbes on to the next generation. And I should say, when the termite queen flies, she carries with her the microbes that her colony will need. She has a way of passing them on. For millions of years, what happened was that our ancestors did that too. Mothers passed gut microbiomes on to their babies during childbirth. Skin microbes were acquired from the soil and from plants, and this was super dependable. But as we've changed our lifestyles, as we've introduced C-sections, as we moved into cities, we now have all these cases where we don't acquire the right microbes, and we're seeing all kinds of problems: inflammatory skin problems, ear infections, cavities, inflammatory bowel, other gut inflammatory problems, allergy, asthma. And these are all complex problems that are multifaceted, but they all have a component that relates to immune function and changes in the microbiome. And so we're seeing that in some real way, we are also mutually unculturable. But what makes us different from the termites is that we not only need the right microbes, we also need all of the food that we eat. And so if we're going to imagine a space settlement, we have to bring the food with us. Well, our food is not just the plant, it's not just the animal, but it's also the species the plant and animal depend on. And so corn depends on hundreds of species to be healthy, of soil microbes, of leaf microbes. Each of the species we depend on requires other species. And so this dependence is very layered. And so as we imagine a space settlement, or as we just imagine the future of cities, we somehow have to account for this dependence. And we're really not doing it yet. And in fact, we've done so little of it that right now, all of the feces from the International Space Station is packed up and brought back to Earth so that Earth organisms can decompose that feces. We don't yet know how to transplant Earth's ecological processes to other realms. And we don't have a great understanding how we're going to transplant those processes even in the future of Earth. And to me, an emblem of the trickiness of these relationships is the case of the plants grown in the International Space Station, which you can see here don't look super healthy. Well, it turns out that a plant pathogen, at least one, was accidentally introduced to the International Space Station and is killing the plants. And so now there are projects to create probiotics for the plants to take to the International Space Station to help defend them against the pathogens. It's messy, it's complex. It's not engineering, it's ecology meets engineering. And so a termite queen, when she flies, needs to carry only her microbes. We, as we fly into the future, as we fly into space, as we just stay in place and go year to year, we have to carry everything. And we also need to carry the species on which we might someday depend, but don't yet depend. Assumption 5 is sort of this medical assumption, which is that we only need to know ourselves. That if we just keep studying human bodies, we'll be able to make sense of who we are well enough to manage our well-being into the future. And this is deeply wrong, and it's something we see again and again, and it's wrong in the sense that we only make sense when compared to others. And so I'm going to give you 2 examples. If we stay talking about this later, I could give you 100 examples. One is work we did that's kind of silly work that turns out to be a little more interesting. And this is work where we tried to figure out what the indoor climate preferences are for people in North America. And what we were able to show is that those climate preferences match our ancient thermal preferences, which are a function of the thermal preferences of primates in general, modified during the last 3 million years of human evolution. And they more or less match the climates of parts of North Africa in which many years of human evolution took place. And so the temperature you like in your house is influenced by our ancient conditions. And that makes sense only in light of the consideration of the preferences of our modern ancestors and our own particular story. This may seem super trivial, except that we now know that as we change the climate of Earth, that peoples who are living in places that get farther and farther from these conditions are going to struggle to deal with the conditions they are going to have in the future. That it's harder to keep the peace as we push away from those preferred temperatures. It's harder to maintain GDP. It's harder to maintain agriculture. And so what seems trivial is actually really important. Not our paper, but the sentiment. Another example, Deanna Beasley, I was a postdoc in my lab a number of years ago, and she started looking at stomach biology. And she thought that the general literature on stomachs was missing something, because the standard literature on stomachs tends to argue that the role of the stomach is to pre-digest some food, to break down protein. But what Deanna had noticed when doing some comparative biology is that humans seem to have pretty weird stomachs, and ours are really acidic, but that's not necessarily the norm. And so she began to wonder, what if it's the case that part of what the stomach is doing is that it serves to kill dangerous bacteria before they get to the intestines and prevents those bacteria from disrupting the gut microbiome. And so what she was able to show is, in fact, those species that are more likely to feed on foods with dangerous pathogens, like the turkey vulture, in fact, have much more acidic stomachs. And this seems to be part of the story. But what's even more interesting is when she zoomed in on primates, that most primates have relatively neutral stomachs or slightly acidic. And then you get the baboons and crab-eating macaques that are more acidic. But humans are really off the chart. We're far more like white-backed vultures than anything else. And compared to chimps, for which there's only one data point, and we'll say it's a big caveat, it seems like something really interesting evolutionarily happened with our stomach acidity. Well, this is interesting to modern medicine because it turns out that stomach acidity impacts many features of how our microbiomes work and many of our modern microbiome problems that I can talk about later. But this only appears as a feature of our biology when we look at this broader context. And so we have to contextualize our own human biology in light of these bigger stories. The sixth and last assumption, and I'm then sort of turn this toward the very end here, is that non-human life has no agency. And this is really implicit in the idea of the Anthropocene, the human era. The idea of the human era is that we control Earth, and that we can manage it poorly or we could manage it well, but that we have the reins. And I think this is actually deeply flawed, because I think that life, like a river, really has agency. And not in the sense that life has the flea's evolutionary biology is conscious and willed, but rather agency in the sense of the capacity of an actor in a given environment. That the details of what happens to that species could come back and affect us in ways that are beyond the particularities of our control. And I would argue that this is the case when we look at the virus that causes COVID-19, that on the one hand, we have influenced the origin of this virus, but the details of how this virus has influenced us are the function of detailed evolutionary changes that are its agency, its ability to control our story. And similarly, we can look at the potato blight, the potato famine, and this is a context in which a fungal pathogen changes the world stage. Now, in both of these cases, we could not predict the details of the story. We've gotten better at it, but it's still quite hard. But in both of these cases, we could have predicted the general features of the story. And so one of the lessons that comes out strongly in the book is, if in these cases we know the rules of ecology and evolution, we can actually anticipate the aspects of the responses of the living world to our decisions in ways that make us much better prepared. And with COVID-19, we see this in the context of the warnings of disease ecologists for 40 years about the potential for new emergent diseases in precisely the region in which the virus that causes COVID-19 evolved. And so we were being warned, but we didn't have a good way to listen to those disease ecologists. I think in the same way, ecology has a lot of lessons for our broader human condition, but we don't have a great way to listen to them. And so a lot of what the book does is to spell out some of those lessons and how we might listen a little bit better. And of course, ecologists and evolutionary biologists are wrong all the time, but nonetheless, we should pay attention to what we do know, because it's the best bet we've got. And so wrapping this up, as we think about the future of cities, my big pitch here is that we need to be managing them in a way that takes into account life in the same way that we took into account gravity or cars or the internet. We need to recognize life as this vital force. And my argument is that the details of the living world will have as much influence in the future as gravity, cars, or the internet. And so the question then becomes, how do we imagine a future city, or indeed a future humanity, that plans as much for a relationship with the rest of life as we plan for gravity or cars or the internet? And I ask you the question, what relationship do we want to have with the rest of life in the year 2100? And this might seem a long time from now, but the truth is we're laying the groundwork right now. You know, lots of the things we're building today will have legacies that are not 100 years, but 1,000 years, or even much longer. And so what kind of influence on that story of life do we want to have? What kinds of actions do we want to be taking? And not just in cities, also thinking about our daily lives, what we're doing in our homes. And I think just recognizing that anytime you're making a decision, anytime you feel like you're alone at the table and nobody's looking, that there's always more to this story. And there's always another species with which you're engaged, whether you recognize it or not. And so I'm going to close here with time for questions. Actually, I'm going to make this final point, which is that I think if we're going to do this, if we're going to pull together this future, the other thing that we're going to need is for all of our disciplines to come together to think about this future together. Ecologists, for most of the last century, evolutionary biologists as well, were taught to go to faraway places to study life. And the program Michael and I were in was part of this tradition. We were taught to do basic ecology and evolution, that we were not supposed to be useful. We were supposed to focus on the remote. And there's a reason for this. When ecologists were founding the field, they looked at cities, they looked at human life, and it looked too messy. And they wanted to be able to found a field in isolation so there could be an identity to the field and it wouldn't be muddied by all of these other things. Well, now we're at a point where we don't have the luxury of just studying these things in isolation. We have to study them with these other fields. We have to take everything we know to make sense of the living world and its future, and to make plans for what we want and hope. And so that's where I think you all come in the story, which is thinking about what future do you hope for? What relationship with life do you hope for? And I'm going to tell one more quick story. Somebody ping me in the chat if it's better if I stop now. I could tell this later. Yeah, I'll tell it now, which is that when I talk to biologists about this, it's very common that biologists say that, well, I don't work on the future, I work on the past. I don't really have any expertise in the future. And when I talk to architects and engineers and city planners, what they say is, look, we're going to build the future whether you guys come to the meeting or not. And so I think it's important we come to the meeting. But the thing that really brought this home for me was a little paper I read about the Cloaca Maxima in Rome. And the Cloaca Maxima was actually built before the time of the Romans, in the time of the Etruscans in 600 BCE. And it was a flood water and then sometimes wastewater tube canal that emptied what is now downtown Rome, and built in 600 BCE. And it was built with more structure, with more planning than it seemed to need. So much so that by 79, Pliny the Elder writes, "In the streets above, massive blocks of stone are dragged along, and yet the tunnels do not cave. They're pounded by falling buildings. The ground is shaken by earth tremors. But in spite of it all, for 700 years, the channels have remained well nigh impregnable." Pretty impressive. More impressive is that in 78, it still looks like this. You can see that little, the tunnel coming out. That's one of the exits of the Cloaca Maxima. Even more amazing is in 1961, Lewis Mumford writes, "With its record of continuous service for more than 2,500 years, that sewer structure proves that in the planning of cities, low first costs do not necessarily denote economy. On these terms, the Cloaca Maxima has turned out to be one of the cheapest pieces of engineering on record." And what's even more amazing is you can go and see it still working today. And so here, what I remind you of is that we can build beautiful, amazing, functional things today that will still be playing a role 2,000 years from now. What does it look like to dream that big? How do we dream that big? How do we have these conversations? And so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rob. That is fantastic. I mean, yeah, I put in the chat at some point, my mind is exploding because it's the way you tie this together is, I mean, so many things. It's really incredible and hopeful.
I can't believe the dog's name is Astro.
Yeah,
Pluto.
Astro.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Darn it.
Not Pluto. I think that's Mickey's.
Yeah, that's Mickey's dog.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.